March 15, 1944, Boston Port of Embarkation, Massachusetts. The American transport ship USS Henrico eases toward Pier 12 while harbor tugs guide her bulk through the gray waters of Boston Harbor. Below deck, 847 Italian prisoners of war clutch their few possessions and wonder what kind of hell awaits them in America. Staff Sergeant Marco Benedetti of the 10th Bersaglieri Regiment presses his face against the salt-stained porthole and sees something that stops his breath. American longshoremen are unloading mountains of supplies. Liberty ships stretch to the horizon, and massive cranes swing cargo containers like toys. This is not the struggling nation that Mussolini's propaganda described. The Italian service units would become the most successful prisoner of war program in American military history. But on this cold March morning, as 1,800 Italian prisoners of war stepped onto American soil for the first time, nobody could have predicted that within 18 months these enemy soldiers would contribute over 90 million man-days of labor to the Allied war effort while saving the United States government an estimated $230 million. The transformation of the Italian prisoners from captured enemies to willing co-belligerents represents one of the most remarkable stories of World War II. A story that began in the dusty prison camps of North Africa and would culminate in the dockyards and victory gardens of Boston, where former enemies would become some of America's most productive wartime workers. The story of the Italian service units begins not in Boston, but in the vast expanses of North Africa, where the British 8th Army and American II Corps had systematically dismantled Italian resistance during Operation Torch and the subsequent Tunisia campaign. By November 1942, following the Allied invasion of French North Africa, more than 51,000 Italian soldiers found themselves in Allied prisoner of war camps, most having been captured during the collapse of Italian forces in Libya and Tunisia. Unlike their German counterparts, who often fought with fanatical determination until the bitter end, many Italian soldiers had surrendered with something approaching relief, particularly those who had never embraced Mussolini's fascist ideology or his disastrous alliance with Hitler's Germany. Captain Antonio Rossi of the 132nd Armored Division RE had been captured near El Alamein in October 1942, and his experience was typical of many Italian prisoners. As he later recalled in his post-war memoirs, the moment of surrender came not as a defeat but as liberation from a war he had never believed in. When the British tanks appeared over the ridge, most of us threw down our weapons without firing a shot, Rossi wrote. We had been fighting for months with inadequate supplies, obsolete equipment, and no real understanding of why we were dying in the desert for Hitler's dreams of conquest. The sight of those Grant tanks, with their thick armor and powerful guns, only confirmed what we already knew. This war was lost before it began. The initial treatment of Italian prisoners of war by Allied forces followed the strict guidelines of the Geneva Convention, but there was an underlying tension that would persist throughout 1942 and into early 1943. While British and American forces recognized their obligation to treat prisoners humanely, there was little sympathy for soldiers who had served under Mussolini's fascist regime, particularly given the brutal conduct of Italian forces in Ethiopia and Albania during the 1930s. However, as Allied intelligence officers began interrogating their Italian captives, a more complex picture emerged. Many of the prisoners expressed not only disillusionment with fascism but active hostility toward the German alliance that had dragged Italy into a war it was unprepared to fight. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, who served as intelligence officer for the II Corps during the Tunisia campaign, noted in his official reports that Italian prisoners were remarkably cooperative during interrogation sessions, often providing detailed information about German defensive positions and troop movements without any coercion. The Italians seemed almost eager to help us defeat the Germans, Morrison wrote in a classified report dated February 1943. Unlike German prisoners, who maintained strict military discipline even in captivity, the Italians appeared to view their capture as an opportunity to extricate themselves from an increasingly hopeless situation. This cooperation became even more pronounced after September 8, 1943. When Marshal Pietro Badoglio announced Italy's surrender to the Allied forces and the formation of a new government that would fight alongside the Allies against Nazi Germany. The Armistice of Cassel transformed Italy from an Axis power to a co-belligerent, though this change in status created complex legal and practical problems for the treatment of Italian prisoners of war who were already in Allied custody. Under international law, These men remained prisoners of war regardless of their government's change of allegiance, but their potential value as allies became immediately apparent to Allied military planners. The decision to establish Italian service units was made at the highest levels of the American military hierarchy, with input from the War Department, the Office of the Provost Marshal General, and the State Department. The driving force behind the program was the acute labor shortage that had developed throughout the United States as millions of American men were drafted into military service and millions more took jobs in defense industries. By early 1944, American agriculture was facing a crisis as harvest crews dwindled and crops rotted in fields across the nation. Similarly, military installations, ports of embarkation, and supply depots were struggling to maintain operations with skeleton crews of civilian workers. General Brehon Somervell, commanding general of the Army Service Forces, saw the Italian prisoners as a potential solution to this manpower crisis. In a memorandum to Secretary of War Henry Stimson dated January 15, 1944, Somervell outlined his vision for what would become the Italian service units. The 51,000 Italian prisoners of war currently held in camps throughout the United States represent an enormous reservoir of manpower that could be employed for essential non-combat duties without violating the Geneva Convention. Given Italy's change of allegiance, these men could reasonably be expected to work willingly for the Allied cause, particularly if offered improved conditions and the opportunity to contribute meaningfully to the defeat of Nazi Germany. The bureaucratic machinery for implementing the Italian service unit program moved with surprising speed, driven by the urgent need for labor and the unique opportunity presented by Italy's surrender. On February 12, 1944, the War Department issued General Order 228, which established the legal framework for the Italian service units and outlined the procedures for recruiting volunteers from existing prisoner of war camps. The order specified that participation in the program would be entirely voluntary, that volunteers would be screened for political reliability and physical fitness, and that they would be employed only in non-combat roles that supported the Allied war effort. The screening process for Italian service unit volunteers was comprehensive and sophisticated, designed to identify men who could be trusted with greater freedom of movement and access to sensitive military installations. Each potential volunteer underwent a thorough background investigation conducted by Army intelligence officers, often assisted by Italian-American interpreters who could detect subtle political nuances in the prisoners' responses. The screening focused particularly on the prisoners' political beliefs, their attitude toward fascism, and their willingness to work actively for Allied victory. Private Giulio Marchetti, who had been captured at Kasserine Pass in February 1943, described the screening process in a letter to his family written after the war. They asked us hundreds of questions about our political beliefs, our families, our reasons for wanting to join the service units. I told them honestly that I had never believed in fascism, that I had been drafted against my will, and that I wanted nothing more than to see the war end so I could return to my family in Tuscany. When they asked if I was willing to work for the American war effort, I said yes without hesitation. What did I owe to Mussolini or Hitler? They had brought nothing but misery to my country. The response to the Italian service unit program exceeded all expectations. Of the approximately 51,000 Italian prisoners of war held in the United States, more than 45,000 volunteered for the program, representing nearly 90% of the total population. This remarkable participation rate reflected not only the improved conditions and freedoms offered by the service units, but also the genuine desire of most Italian prisoners to contribute to the defeat of Nazi Germany and the eventual liberation of their homeland. The volunteers who were accepted into the Italian service units received a significant upgrade in their living conditions and privileges compared to regular prisoners of war. They were issued American military uniforms bearing distinctive patches that read, "Italy," and were housed in less restrictive facilities that often resembled military barracks more than prison camps. Perhaps most importantly, they were paid for their labor at the same rate as American soldiers of equivalent rank, with enlisted men receiving 80 cents per day and officers receiving monthly allowances ranging from $20 to $40 depending on their rank. The remaining 5,000 to 6,000 Italian prisoners who either refused to volunteer or were deemed unsuitable for the program were classified as non-cooperative and transferred to isolated camps in remote areas of Texas, Arizona, Wyoming, and Hawaii. These facilities, including the notorious Camp No. 1 in Hereford, Texas, which the Italian service unit members nicknamed Campo Ducks, after Mussolini's fascist youth camps, housed prisoners who were considered security risks due to their continued allegiance to fascist ideology or their potential for subversive activity. The contrast between the experiences of cooperative and non-cooperative Italian prisoners was stark and intentional. While Italian service unit members enjoyed relative freedom of movement, opportunities for education and recreation, and regular interaction with American civilians and military personnel, the non-cooperative prisoners faced the standard restrictions applied to German and Japanese prisoners of war, including minimal contact with the outside world, limited recreational activities, and strict confinement to their designated camps. For the 45,000 Italian volunteers who joined the service units, the transformation from prisoners of war to co-belligerent workers represented not just a change in legal status but a fundamental shift in their relationship with their American captors. No longer viewed primarily as security threats to be contained, they became valued contributors to the Allied war effort, working alongside American civilians and military personnel in a variety of essential roles. The deployment of Italian service units across the United States followed strategic considerations that balanced security concerns with labor needs. The largest concentrations of Italian service unit workers were established at major ports of embarkation, military depots, and agricultural centers where their labor could have the greatest impact on the war effort. The New York Port of Embarkation employed thousands of Italian workers at facilities in Bayonne, New Jersey, Camp Kilmer, and Camp Shanks, where they loaded supplies and equipment bound for European battlefields. In California, Italian service units were deployed extensively in agricultural work, helping to maintain crop production that was essential for feeding both American civilians and military forces. The 8th Italian Quartermaster Service Company worked at Camp Anza, while other units were stationed at Fort Ord, Camp Cook, and the Benicia Arsenal. The climate and agricultural character of California proved particularly appealing to many Italian workers, whose Mediterranean heritage had prepared them for the farming techniques required in the region. The assignment of 1,800 Italian service unit members to the Boston area in March 1944 represented one of the largest single deployments of the program and reflected the critical importance of Boston as a major port of embarkation for supplies and personnel bound for the European theater. The Boston Port of Embarkation, located in South Boston, was one of the busiest military shipping facilities on the East Coast, handling thousands of tons of cargo daily and serving as the departure point for countless American servicemen heading to Britain and France. The initial housing arrangement for the Italian service unit members in Boston placed them at Camp McKay, a hastily constructed facility located on a peninsula in South Boston near Carson Beach. The location of Camp McKay proved to be problematic from the outset, as it placed the Italian workers in close proximity to a densely populated civilian neighborhood that was already suspicious of foreign influences and resentful of what many residents perceived as preferential treatment for enemy soldiers. The physical layout of Camp McKay consisted of standard military barracks surrounded by a single fence topped with barbed wire, but the security arrangements were far less restrictive than those typically employed for prisoner of war camps. Italian service unit members were allowed to move freely within the compound, could receive visitors during designated hours, and were permitted to leave the facility for work assignments and approved recreational activities. This relative freedom, while essential for the effective utilization of their labor, created tension with local residents who questioned why enemy soldiers enjoyed privileges that were sometimes denied to American civilians. The work assignments for Italian service unit members in Boston focused primarily on cargo handling and logistics support at the Port of Embarkation, but their duties extended to a wide variety of tasks that supported the overall war effort. Teams of Italian workers loaded and unloaded ships carrying military supplies to Europe, maintained and repaired dock facilities, sorted and inventoried equipment in vast warehouses, and performed construction and maintenance work at military installations throughout the Boston area. Sergeant Mario Fontana of the 3rd Alpini Regiment, who served with the Italian service unit at Boston, described the scale and complexity of the port operations in a memoir published after the war. Every day we would report to the docks at 7 in the morning and work until 6 in the evening, loading everything imaginable onto ships bound for England and France. Tanks, artillery pieces, trucks, ammunition, medical supplies, food, clothing, fuel, the sheer volume of material was staggering. We worked alongside American longshoremen and soldiers, and many of them told us they had never seen anything like the industrial capacity that America could bring to bear on the war effort. The productivity of Italian service unit workers consistently exceeded expectations, earning praise from American supervisors and military commanders who had initially been skeptical about the program's potential effectiveness. Colonel Robert Hayes, commanding officer of the Boston Port of Embarkation, noted in his monthly reports that Italian workers often outperformed their American counterparts in terms of both quantity and quality of work, particularly in tasks requiring physical endurance or technical skill. The Italian service unit personnel have proven to be exceptionally reliable and hardworking, Hayes wrote in a report dated June 1944. Their experience with manual labor and their motivation to contribute to the war effort have made them invaluable assets to our operations. Many of our American supervisors have commented that they would be happy to employ these men permanently if circumstances permitted. Beyond their primary duties at the Port of Embarkation, Italian service unit members in Boston were also employed in a variety of community service roles that brought them into direct contact with American civilians. Teams of Italian workers maintained public parks, worked in victory gardens that provided fresh vegetables for military mess halls and civilian consumption, and assisted with construction projects that supported the overall war effort. The Victory Garden program, in particular, provided an opportunity for Italian service unit members to demonstrate their agricultural skills while contributing to American food security. The gardens, located in Franklin Park and other areas around Boston, were expanded significantly with the help of Italian labor, and the fresh produce they generated helped to offset wartime food shortages while reducing the demand for commercially grown crops that were needed for military consumption. Private Giuseppe Benedetto, who worked in the Victory Gardens, later recalled the satisfaction he felt in contributing to American food production. Working in the gardens reminded me of my family's farm in Sicily, and it felt good to be growing food instead of destroying it. The American families who supervised the gardens were kind to us, and many of them shared their meals with us or invited us to their homes on Sundays. It was the first time since I had been captured that I felt like a human being rather than just a prisoner. However, the relative freedom and privileges enjoyed by Italian service unit members also created significant tension with some segments of the Boston community, particularly in the working-class neighborhoods of South Boston where Camp McKay was located. Many local residents, who had family members serving in combat overseas or who had lost sons and brothers in the war, questioned the wisdom of providing comfortable accommodations and employment opportunities to men who had recently been fighting for the enemy. The tension reached a breaking point during the summer of 1944, culminating in what would later be described as the only documented soccer riot in Boston history. The incident began on July 16, 1944, when a group of Italian service unit members organized an informal soccer match near the perimeter fence of Camp McKay. As the game progressed, a crowd of local spectators gathered, including a number of young women who began cheering for the Italian players and engaging in what contemporary reports described as flirtatious behavior through the fence. The sight of American women fraternizing with enemy soldiers, even those who were technically co-belligerents, proved inflammatory to many local residents who had gathered to watch the match. Tensions escalated throughout the afternoon as more spectators arrived, and the interaction between the Italian players and American women became more animated. By evening, what had begun as a sporting event had devolved into a near riot as angry crowds threw stones at the Italian players and demanded that military authorities put an end to what they viewed as inappropriate contact between enemy soldiers and American women. Military police were called to restore order, but the incident highlighted the fundamental challenge of the Italian service unit program: how to effectively utilize enemy prisoners as productive workers while maintaining public support for their presence in American communities. The soccer riot at Carson Beach was not an isolated incident, but rather the most dramatic example of the ongoing tension between the practical benefits of the Italian service unit program and the emotional resistance of Americans who struggled to accept former enemies as allies. Colonel Daniel Murphy, the commanding officer responsible for Italian service unit operations in the Boston area, recognized that the location of Camp McKay was untenable and that a solution had to be found that would allow the program to continue while addressing legitimate community concerns. After consulting with his superiors and conducting a thorough review of alternative sites, Murphy recommended that the Italian service unit members be relocated to Fort Andrews on Pettick's Island in Boston Harbor. The decision to move the Italian service unit to Pettix Island represented both a practical solution to the immediate security concerns and a symbolic recognition of the changed status of the Italian workers. Pettix Island, located approximately 3 miles from downtown Boston in the outer harbor, had served as a military installation since the 1890s and featured Fort Andrews, a coastal artillery post that had been used for training and staging operations during World War I and the early years of World War II. The isolation provided by Pettix Island offered several advantages for the continued operation of the Italian service unit program. The physical separation from civilian populations eliminated the potential for the kind of incidents that had occurred at Camp McKay, while still allowing Italian workers to commute daily to their assignments at the Boston Port of Embarkation via military transport boats. The island's existing military infrastructure, including barracks, mess halls, recreational facilities, and administrative buildings, could accommodate the 1,300 Italian service unit members with minimal additional construction. On July 28, 1944, 12 days after the soccer riot at Carson Beach, the bulk of the Italian service unit contingent was transferred from Camp McKay to Fort Andrews on Pettix Island. The move was conducted with military efficiency, using a fleet of military vessels to transport the Italian workers and their personal belongings across Boston Harbor to their new home. The remaining 500 Italian service unit members were relocated to Camp Miles Standish in Taunton, Massachusetts, where they would work primarily in support of military training operations and depot maintenance. The transition to Pettix Island marked a new phase in the relationship between the Italian service unit members and their American supervisors, characterized by increased trust and expanded privileges that reflected the proven reliability of the Italian workers. The island setting provided opportunities for recreational activities and educational programs that had been impossible at the more restrictive Camp McKay facility. Fort Andrews offered amenities that were unusual for a prisoner of war facility, including a gymnasium, a chapel, recreational areas, and classroom space for educational programs. Italian service unit members were encouraged to take advantage of English language classes that were offered twice weekly, and many participated in vocational training programs that taught skills relevant to their work assignments. The island's relative isolation also allowed for more flexible scheduling of recreational activities, including sports competitions, musical performances, and social events that helped to build morale and maintain unit cohesion. The daily routine on Pettix Island reflected the unique status of the Italian service unit members as neither prisoners nor free civilians but something in between. Reveille sounded at 0600 hours, followed by breakfast in the main mess hall where Italian cooks prepared meals that combined American military rations with traditional Italian recipes when ingredients were available. Work assignments began at 0800 hours, with most Italian workers boarding military boats for the short trip across Boston Harbor to the Port of Embarkation and other work sites throughout the city. The boat commute itself became a symbol of the trust that had developed between the Italian workers and their American supervisors. Unlike traditional prisoner of war operations, which required constant armed supervision, the Italian service unit members traveled to and from their work assignments with minimal security oversight. Armed guards were present on the boats, but their role was more protective than restrictive, designed to ensure the safety of the Italian workers rather than to prevent escape attempts. Private Alessandro Romano, who spent more than a year on Pettix Island, described the daily routine in a letter to his family written shortly after the war. "Our life on the island was better than many Italian soldiers experienced during the war, even those who were never captured. We had regular meals, clean barracks, medical care when we needed it, and work that gave us a sense of purpose. Most importantly, we were treated with dignity and respect by our American supervisors, who seemed to understand that we were no longer their enemies, but their allies in the fight against Nazi Germany." The work assignments for Italian service unit members based on Pettix Island expanded beyond the traditional cargo handling duties to include specialized tasks that took advantage of their particular skills and experience. Many Italian workers who had been masons, carpenters, or mechanics in civilian life were assigned to construction and maintenance projects that required their technical expertise. Others with agricultural backgrounds worked in expanded Victory Garden programs or at farms in the surrounding countryside where their labor helped to maintain crop production despite wartime manpower shortages. One of the most successful aspects of the Italian Service Unit program was the integration of Italian workers with American civilian employees and military personnel who worked alongside them at various job sites. This interaction, which had been carefully managed to avoid the kind of tensions that had led to the Carson Beach riot, generally resulted in positive relationships that helped to humanize the Italian workers in the eyes of their American colleagues. James Sullivan, a civilian supervisor at the Boston Port of Embarkation, later recalled his experience working with Italian service unit members. At first, I was skeptical about working with enemy soldiers, even if they were supposed to be on our side now. But it didn't take long to realize that these men were just regular guys who wanted to do a good job and get home to their families when the war was over. Many of them spoke some English, and they were eager to learn more about American ways of doing things. By the end of the war, I considered several of them to be personal friends. The educational and cultural programs available to Italian service unit members on Petix Island reflected the American military's recognition that these men would eventually return to Italy and could serve as ambassadors for American values and democratic ideals. English language instruction was expanded beyond basic conversational skills to include lessons in American history, civics, and democratic institutions. These programs were voluntary, but participation rates were high, with more than 80% of Italian service unit members taking advantage of educational opportunities during their time on the island. Captain Maria Rossetti, one of the few Italian officers who volunteered for the service unit program despite the fact that Geneva Convention provisions exempted officers from mandatory labor, established an informal library in one of the Fort Andrews buildings where Italian workers could access books, magazines, and newspapers in both Italian and English. The library became a popular gathering place during evening hours and helped to maintain intellectual stimulation for men who might otherwise have been isolated from cultural and educational opportunities. The religious life of Italian service unit members was also accommodated through arrangements with local Catholic parishes that provided regular religious services and pastoral care. Father Michael O'Connor of St. Anthony's Church in the north end of Boston traveled to Petix Island weekly to conduct Mass and provide spiritual counseling to Italian workers who requested it. These services were conducted in both Italian and Latin, allowing the men to participate in familiar liturgical traditions while also providing opportunities for interaction with American Catholic clergy. Perhaps most significantly, the Italian Service Unit program on Petix Island included provisions for family visits and correspondence that were unprecedented for prisoners of war. Italian workers who had relatives living in the Boston area were permitted to receive visits during designated hours, and all service unit members were encouraged to maintain regular correspondence with their families in Italy through a mail system that was subject to censorship but generally allowed for free expression of personal thoughts and feelings. The correspondence between Italian service unit members and their families provided valuable intelligence for Allied authorities about conditions in German-occupied Italy and the effectiveness of Allied propaganda efforts. Letters from family members often contained information about German troop movements, the impact of Allied bombing campaigns, and the morale of Italian civilians under German occupation. This intelligence was carefully analyzed by Allied intelligence officers and contributed to strategic planning for the continued campaign in Italy. Corporal Enzo Marchetti, whose family lived in the German-occupied north of Italy, received letters that provided detailed information about the German retreat following the Allied breakout from the Anzio beachhead in June 1944. His letters home, which were carefully crafted to avoid providing useful intelligence to German censors while still conveying his well-being to his family, included subtle references to American industrial capacity and military preparation that were designed to boost civilian morale in occupied Italy. The success of the Italian Service Unit program in Boston was measured not only by the quantity and quality of work performed, but also by the absence of security incidents and disciplinary problems that had been anticipated by critics of the program. During the entire period of operation on Petix Island, from July 1944 to September 1945, not a single Italian service unit member went absent without leave, AWOL, attempted to escape, or was involved in serious disciplinary infractions. This remarkable record of compliance and cooperation exceeded the expectations of even the program's most optimistic supporters. The trustee system that was implemented on Petix Island allowed approximately 50 Italian service unit members to earn additional privileges through exemplary behavior and demonstrated reliability. Trustees were permitted to leave the island for supervised recreational activities in Boston, including visits to museums, cultural events, and social gatherings with Italian-American families who had volunteered to serve as sponsors. These activities provided valuable opportunities for cultural exchange and helped to build bridges between the Italian workers and the broader Boston community. The most coveted privilege available to trustees was the opportunity to participate in weekend excursions to Boston's North End, where they could visit with Italian-American families, attend social events at local churches, and experience something approaching normal civilian life. These visits were carefully supervised by American military personnel, but the supervision was generally unobtrusive, allowing for meaningful interaction between the Italian workers and their American hosts. During these visits, many Italian service unit members were introduced to aspects of American culture and society that challenged their preconceptions about life in the United States. The prosperity and abundance that they observed in American homes, the availability of consumer goods despite wartime rationing, and the democratic traditions that governed American political life all contributed to a growing appreciation for American values and institutions among the Italian workers. Private Paolo Ferrara, who participated in the trustee program, later wrote about his first visit to an Italian-American family in the North End. When Mrs. Benedetto invited me to her home for Sunday dinner, I expected to find conditions similar to what we had experienced in Italy during the war. Rationing, shortages, make-do arrangements. Instead, I found a table loaded with food, a warm and comfortable home, and a family that welcomed me as if I were their own son. It was then that I began to understand why America would win this war. It was not just because of their factories and their weapons, but because of their spirit and their belief in the future. The social relationships that developed between Italian service unit members and American families sometimes evolved into romantic attachments that created complex legal and emotional challenges for all parties involved. The Geneva Convention prohibited marriage between prisoners of war and civilians of the detaining power, but it could not prevent the formation of emotional bonds that would persist long after the war's end. The Boston Globe featured several stories about Italian service unit members who had fallen in love with American women, including the well-publicized cases of Nello Moretti and Sabine Piscitelli, and Frank Pace and Netta Marmoral, both couples from the East Boston community. These relationships, which were conducted under the watchful eyes of military censors and family members, represented both the success of the integration program and the human cost of policies that prevented immediate reunification of couples who had found love during wartime. The resolution of these romantic relationships required creativity and patience from all parties involved. Military regulations prevented Italian service unit members from remaining in the United States after the war, and immigration quotas made it difficult for them to return as civilian immigrants. As a result, many American women who had fallen in love with Italian workers traveled to Italy after the war to marry their sweethearts, with plans to return to the United States together once immigration procedures could be completed. The story of Giuseppe Ciaffis, whose daughter later submitted a photograph to the Boston Harbor Islands National Park Service, illustrates both the typical experience of Italian service unit members and the lasting impact of the program on individual lives. Ciaffis, who was captured in North Africa in 1943, volunteered for the service unit program and spent more than a year on Petix Island working at the Boston Port of Embarkation. His daughter's caption for the photograph read, "My father, Giuseppe Ciaffis, was POW on Petix Island during World War II. He collaborated with the Americans and was made to feel very comfortable during his stay at Fort Andrews." The economic impact of the Italian service unit program extended far beyond the immediate value of the labor performed by the 45,000 volunteers. The official estimate of $230 million in savings to the United States government, while impressive in absolute terms, represented only a fraction of the total economic benefit generated by the program. The availability of Italian workers allowed American military personnel to be deployed in combat roles rather than support functions, potentially shortening the war and reducing the overall cost in both human and economic terms. The calculation of the program's economic value included direct labor costs that would have been required to hire civilian workers or assign military personnel to perform the same tasks, but it did not account for the indirect benefits of having experienced and motivated workers available for immediate deployment wherever they were needed most. The flexibility and reliability of Italian service unit workers made them particularly valuable for urgent projects and emergency situations where civilian labor might not have been available. Colonel William Harrison, who served as liaison between the Office of the Provost Marshal General and the various Italian service unit installations, estimated that the program's indirect economic benefits were at least equal to the direct savings calculated by the War Department. The Italian service units provided us with a labor force that was available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for any task that supported the war effort, Harrison noted in his post-war report. This kind of flexibility and dedication would have been impossible to achieve with civilian workers or even with American military personnel who had other duties and responsibilities. The productivity statistics compiled by individual Italian service unit installations support Harrison's assessment of the program's exceptional value. At Rock Island Arsenal, for example, 25 Italian workers were credited with logging more than 30,000 hours of labor and saving more than $14,000 in lumber salvage operations alone. When these figures are extrapolated across all Italian service unit operations, the total economic impact becomes truly staggering. Beyond the immediate economic benefits, the Italian service unit program also provided valuable intelligence about Italian society, politics, and military capabilities that contributed to Allied planning for the post-war occupation and reconstruction of Italy. The extensive interviews and surveys conducted with Italian service unit members provided Allied authorities with detailed information about the effectiveness of fascist propaganda, the extent of popular support for Mussolini's regime, and the challenges that would face democratic institutions in post-war Italy. Major Robert Caldwell, who served as intelligence liaison for the Italian service unit program, compiled detailed reports based on interviews with hundreds of Italian workers about their experiences under fascist rule and their observations about American democratic institutions. These reports, which were classified for decades after the war, provided valuable insights into the political and social factors that would influence Italy's transition to democracy. The Italian service unit members represent a cross-section of Italian society. Caldwell wrote in a report dated August 1944, "Their backgrounds range from urban professionals to rural farmers, from committed anti-fascists to men who were simply apolitical. Their responses to our questions about American democratic institutions and their experiences working alongside American civilians provide valuable data about the potential for democratic development in post-war Italy." The intelligence gathered through the Italian service unit program also contributed to Allied understanding of German military capabilities and strategic planning. Many Italian workers had served alongside German forces in North Africa, Sicily, and mainland Italy, and their detailed knowledge of German tactics, equipment, and troop dispositions provided valuable tactical intelligence for ongoing Allied operations. Staff Sergeant Roberto Gelli, who had served with the German-Italian Panzer Army Africa under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, provided detailed information about German anti-tank tactics and defensive strategies that was incorporated into Allied training programs and tactical doctrines. His debriefings, conducted over a period of several months, included sketches of German defensive positions, descriptions of new weapons and equipment, and assessments of German morale and combat effectiveness. The psychological impact of the Italian service unit program on both the Italian participants and their American supervisors represented an important but often overlooked aspect of the program's success. For the Italian workers, the opportunity to contribute meaningfully to the Allied war effort provided a sense of purpose and redemption that helped to counteract the shame and guilt that many felt about their country's role in the Axis alliance. Dr. Anthony Benedetto, a psychiatrist who served with the Army Medical Corps and conducted psychological evaluations of Italian service unit members, noted significant improvements in morale and mental health among the participants compared to Italian prisoners who remained in traditional prisoner of war camps. The opportunity to work productively and to be treated with dignity and respect has had a profoundly positive impact on these men, Benedetto wrote in his clinical notes. Many of them have told me that they feel they are finally fighting on the right side of this war. For American military personnel and civilians who worked alongside Italian service unit members, the program provided valuable lessons about the possibility of reconciliation and cooperation between former enemies. Many Americans who had initially been skeptical or hostile toward the Italian workers gradually developed relationships of mutual respect and even friendship that challenged their preconceptions about national character and the nature of warfare. The success of the Italian service unit program also had broader implications for American military doctrine and post-war planning. The demonstrated effectiveness of converting enemy prisoners into productive allies suggested new approaches to prisoner of war management and psychological warfare that would influence Allied policies in subsequent conflicts. General Omar Bradley, who observed Italian service unit operations during his visits to stateside installations, later wrote that the program represented a new kind of warfare that sought to win hearts and minds rather than simply to destroy enemy forces. Bradley's observations contributed to the development of civil affairs doctrine and reconstruction policies that would be employed during the Allied occupation of Germany and Japan. The contrast between the treatment of Italian, German, and Japanese prisoners of war in American custody highlighted the complex relationship between military necessity, political considerations, and humanitarian principles that governed Allied prisoner of war policies. While Italian service unit members enjoyed unprecedented freedoms and privileges, German prisoners were treated according to strict Geneva Convention guidelines that maintained clear distinctions between captors and captives. German prisoners of war in the United States, numbering more than 425,000 by the end of the war, were employed in agricultural and industrial work similar to that performed by Italian service unit members, but under much more restrictive conditions. German prisoners were housed in heavily guarded compounds, were prohibited from fraternizing with American civilians, and were subject to constant surveillance to prevent escape attempts and sabotage activities. The different treatment accorded to Italian and German prisoners reflected both practical considerations about security risks and political calculations about post-war relationships. While Italy had become a co-belligerent fighting alongside the Allies, Germany remained an enemy power whose ultimate defeat would require unconditional surrender and occupation. The potential for German prisoners to serve as intelligence sources for ongoing enemy operations made them inherently more dangerous than Italian prisoners whose government was actively cooperating with Allied forces. Japanese prisoners of war, who numbered fewer than 2,000 in American custody due to the cultural stigma attached to surrender in Japanese military culture, were treated with similar restrictions to German prisoners but were often viewed with even greater suspicion due to racial prejudices and fears about Japanese military fanaticism. The small number of Japanese prisoners also made it impractical to develop specialized programs comparable to the Italian service units. The differential treatment of Axis prisoners in American custody demonstrated the extent to which practical military considerations often superseded abstract principles of equal treatment under international law. While all prisoners were guaranteed basic rights under the Geneva Convention, the specific conditions of their captivity varied significantly based on assessments of security risks, political reliability, and potential value as contributors to the Allied war effort. As the European war moved toward its conclusion in the spring of 1945, the future of the Italian service unit program became a subject of intense debate within the American military and political establishment. The approaching end of hostilities would eliminate the legal basis for holding Italian nationals as prisoners of war, but it would also create new challenges related to repatriation and post-war reconstruction. The question of whether Italian service unit members should be allowed to remain in the United States as immigrants was particularly complex, involving legal, political, and humanitarian considerations that reflected broader debates about American immigration policy and post-war international relationships. While many Italian workers had expressed interest in remaining in America, and many American employers and community members supported their permanent settlement, existing immigration quotas and legal restrictions made immediate permanent settlement impossible for most participants. The War Department's official policy, established in consultation with the State Department and other federal agencies, required the repatriation of all Italian service unit members to Italy regardless of their personal preferences or relationships with American citizens. This policy was based on strict interpretation of Geneva Convention requirements and concerns about establishing precedents that could complicate the repatriation of American prisoners of war held by enemy powers. However, the policy also recognized that many Italian service unit members would likely be able to return to the United States as immigrants through normal legal channels once post-war immigration procedures were reestablished. American employers who had worked with Italian service unit members were encouraged to maintain contact with their former employees and to sponsor their immigration applications when circumstances permitted. The repatriation process for Italian service unit members began in September 1945, following the Japanese surrender and the official end of World War II. The process was carefully planned to ensure that Italian workers were returned to Italy with dignity and with tangible evidence of their service to the Allied cause. Each Italian service unit member received a certificate of service signed by his commanding officer, along with letters of recommendation that could be used to support future employment or immigration applications. The transportation arrangements for repatriation reflected the changed status of the Italian workers from prisoners of war to honored allies. Rather than being shipped home in the holds of military transports like conventional prisoners of war, Italian service unit members were accommodated in converted troop ships with conditions similar to those provided for American military personnel returning from overseas service. The USS Wasp, which had been converted from an aircraft carrier to a troop transport at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, carried 1,247 Italian service unit members on its first repatriation voyage to Naples in November 1945. The symbolic significance of using a vessel named for the ship that had been lost fighting alongside Italian forces in the Mediterranean was not lost on the Italian passengers, many of whom viewed the voyage as a fitting conclusion to their service with the American military. During the repatriation voyages, Italian service unit members were permitted to carry personal belongings weighing up to 100 pounds, compared to the 55-pound limit typically imposed on prisoners of war. This additional allowance was intended to accommodate souvenirs, gifts, and personal items that the Italian workers had acquired during their time in the United States and wanted to share with their families in Italy. The arrival of repatriated Italian service unit members in Italy provided valuable propaganda opportunities for Allied authorities who were working to establish democratic institutions and pro-Western sentiment in post-war Italy. The returning workers served as living testimonies to American generosity and democratic values, carrying with them stories of fair treatment, economic opportunity, and personal dignity that contrasted sharply with the harsh realities of life under German occupation. Captain Francesco Romano, who had served as a company commander in the Italian service unit program, was interviewed by Allied correspondents upon his return to Italy and provided a detailed account of his experiences that was widely published in Italian newspapers. "The Americans treated us not as conquered enemies, but as future allies," Romano told reporters. "They gave us work that restored our dignity, education that expanded our horizons, and friendship that transcended national boundaries. These are the values that will build a better future for Italy and for all of Europe." The long-term impact of the Italian service unit program extended far beyond its immediate contribution to the Allied war effort. The 45,000 Italian men who participated in the program returned to Italy with first-hand knowledge of American democratic institutions, industrial capabilities, and social values that would influence Italian political and economic development for decades to come. Many former Italian service unit members played important roles in Italy's post-war reconstruction, bringing with them technical skills, organizational experience, and political perspectives that had been shaped by their exposure to American democratic traditions. Their influence was particularly important in northern Italy, where their knowledge of American industrial and agricultural methods contributed to the economic recovery that would transform Italy into a major European industrial power. The personal relationships that had developed between Italian service unit members and American families also contributed to ongoing cultural and economic ties between Italy and the United States. Many of the romantic relationships that had begun during the war eventually resulted in marriages and permanent immigration, creating family networks that facilitated continued exchange of people, ideas, and resources between the two countries. Giuseppe Benedetto, who had worked in the Boston Victory Gardens, eventually returned to the United States in 1948 after marrying Margaret Sullivan, the daughter of his former American supervisor. His immigration was sponsored by the Sullivan family, and he established a successful landscaping business in the Boston area that employed techniques he had learned both in Italy and during his service with the Italian service unit. The documentation and preservation of Italian service unit history became an important project for historians, archivists, and community organizations interested in recording the experiences of participants and understanding the broader implications of the program. The National Archives collected extensive records related to the program, including personnel files, operational reports, correspondence, and photographs that provide detailed documentation of daily life and work activities. Local historical societies and community organizations, particularly in areas where Italian service units had been stationed, also worked to preserve memories and artifacts related to the program. The Boston Harbor Islands National Park Service developed interpretive programs and exhibits that highlighted the Italian service unit experience on POWs Island, helping to educate visitors about this little-known chapter of World War II history. Academic researchers and historians have continued to study the Italian service unit program as an example of innovative prisoner of war management and as a case study in the transformation of enemy relationships during wartime. Their research has contributed to broader understanding of the factors that contribute to successful rehabilitation and reintegration of former combatants, with implications for contemporary conflict resolution and post-conflict reconstruction efforts. The statistical legacy of the Italian service unit program provides concrete evidence of its extraordinary success. The 90 million man-days of labor contributed by 45,000 Italian volunteers over a period of approximately 18 months represents an average of 2,000 days of work per participant, a level of productivity that exceeded expectations and demonstrated the potential for converting former enemies into productive allies. The $230 million in cost savings estimated by the War Department represents only the most conservative calculation of the program's economic value. When indirect benefits such as improved efficiency, reduced security costs, and enhanced military flexibility are included, the total economic impact was likely much higher. Perhaps most importantly, the security record of the Italian service unit program validated the concept of treating prisoners of war as potential allies rather than simply as security threats to be contained. The absence of serious security incidents, escape attempts, or sabotage activities among the 45,000 participants demonstrated that trust and cooperation could be more effective than coercion and restriction in managing large populations of former enemy personnel. The success of the Italian service unit program also provided a model for subsequent American military operations involving the rehabilitation and reintegration of former enemy combatants. Elements of the Italian service unit approach were incorporated into occupation policies in Germany and Japan, and similar concepts have been employed in more recent conflicts where the transformation of former enemies into allies has been a strategic objective. As the last veterans of World War II pass away and direct memories of the conflict fade into history, the story of the Italian service units serves as a reminder that even in the midst of total war, it is possible to find opportunities for reconciliation, cooperation, and mutual understanding. The 45,000 Italian men who volunteered to work alongside their former enemies demonstrated that national boundaries and military allegiances need not be permanent barriers to human cooperation and friendship. The legacy of the Italian service units continues to influence contemporary discussions about prisoner of war treatment, conflict resolution, and post-conflict reconstruction. Their story provides evidence that policies based on trust, dignity, and shared purpose can be more effective than those based solely on coercion and punishment, even in dealing with former enemies. The transformation of 45,000 Italian prisoners of war from captured enemies to productive allies represents one of the most successful rehabilitation programs in military history. Their contribution of 90 million man-days of labor and $230 million in cost savings provided tangible benefits to the Allied war effort, but their longer-term impact on Italian-American relations and their demonstration of the possibility for reconciliation between former enemies may be their most important legacy. Today, visitors to POWs Island can still see the remnants of Fort Andrews where Italian service unit members lived and worked during the final year of World War II. The restored chapel, the remaining barracks foundations, and the interpretive exhibits provide tangible connections to a story that illustrates both the horrors of war and the human capacity for redemption and renewal. The story of the Italian service units reminds us that even in the darkest chapters of human history, there are opportunities for hope, cooperation, and the building of bridges between former enemies. The 45,000 Italian men who chose to work alongside their American captors rather than remain idle in prisoner of war camps made a choice that not only contributed to Allied victory but also pointed toward a future in which former enemies could become friends and allies in the cause of peace and prosperity. Their story deserves to be remembered not just as a footnote to World War II history, but as an inspiring example of the power of human dignity, mutual respect, and shared purpose to overcome the divisions created by war and conflict. In an age when the world still struggles with the aftermath of conflicts and the challenge of transforming enemies into allies, the legacy of the Italian service units remains as relevant and important as ever.